Hi, Jon Gibs. I was just on a panel here at OMMA Video. I am the Senior Vice President of Analytics at the Nielsen Company. So what we were spending a lot of time talking about in the panel is really media comparability and really understanding sort of how we look at online inventory versus TV inventory as we move into the upfront. And I think there's a couple of big challenges that we have to think about and that we talked about in that panel. One is how do we compare from an audience perspective online inventory to TV inventory? Another thing that we have to think about is when we're just looking at online inventory, how does ad load matter? And how does creative matter? And how do we think about those things? So I think one of the big things that came out of the panel is that comparability does matter. Comparability is really important, and being able to have a comparable set of metrics that allows us to understand how to allocate media properly across online and TV and different types of video is super critical. Important to brands and advertisers, but also important to media companies as well, and important to agencies. So media companies need to be able to understand how they want to package their inventory across platforms, and the best way to do that is to have equivalency in their inventory. So one of the things we found, particularly when you take a look across media, is that online inventory definitely helps TV inventory. We do see a significant lift from Nielsen IAG data in the impact of TV advertising when somebody's also been exposed to online creative. So we do know that packaging does make sense. The other thing that we find is when we just look at online inventory by itself, we know that pod length doesn't matter a super amount. We do see some degradation in terms of people's attentiveness to inventory levels depending on pod length, but not a lot of deviation. And we see that both in the Nielsen IAG data, we also see that in our video analytics data, where when we take a look at the degree to which people watch ads all the way through, varying on different pod lengths, people tend to watch most ads all the way through. One of the reasons we believe that tends to be the case for online video, regardless of pod length, is because people watch online video from a very directed standpoint. People, pick a program they want to watch. In some cases, they pick the ads they want to watch, and they just tend to watch the whole thing. They're not skipping channels. And so pod length doesn't really matter. So this really does allow media companies to be able to have larger pods and larger inventory levels so they can monetize that content a lot better. One of the interesting pieces of feedback we got on the panel, though, from one of the agency guys is that if you add more inventory, you actually decrease the CPM of the existing inventory. So obviously publishers need to sort of think about that balance.
Question related to engagement on a publisher's website.
Yeah.
Do you have any data that shows either whether it's happening or not, that if I hit CNN.com and I watch one video and there's an ad related to that, versus you who actually keeps clicking through because maybe you watch 5 videos on CNN, is there higher engagement for the person who's watching video 2, 3, 4, 5?
We've noticed that actually tends to vary a lot from site to site to site. It tends to vary a lot by content type. So, if you take a look at a news site, in some cases, it'll simply depend on the relevancy of the way the stories themselves have been sequenced. And so there's a lot of variability. So if I have a business news story on a news site followed by an entertainment news story, the relevancy of the entertainment story may be so much less than the initial click that you kind of lose that engagement that you're talking about. So there's something to be said about sort of creating a sort of a playlist together that makes sense to be able to promote that type of engagement that you're talking about. In some cases, you'll have something like YouTube where there'll be sort of off keywords. There'll be sort of a playlist that's almost being built for you off tags. And we do tend to see that type of relevancy tends to build a higher level of engagement within that content itself. Where you tend to have sort of bigger problems is when you end up having sort of bad intelligence, where you end up having, well, this is an piece of entertainment content, and this is a piece of entertainment content, and therefore we're going to link all those together. Well, if one of those pieces of entertainment content is an episode of a clip of 30 Rock, and another one is a entirely unrelated, NBC reality show, just entertainment to entertainment doesn't help. You need to have relevancy that connects them. So one of the big sort of pushes that we've seen within the company overall is this idea of understanding the mix between paid, earned, and owned media online. And paid media is pretty straightforward how you measure and think about that. But the type of stuff that you're talking about, which is owned media, which is sort of like I'm producing my own content, I'm producing stuff that either I'm going to be streaming from my site, I'm going to make it so a consumer can embed that content in their Twitter feed or whatever else, or it kind of runs as sort of a pseudo ad unit. We do see a lot of value on that, but that again is also highly, highly dependent on creative. So there's a great example a couple of years ago, I think it was a campaign that Nissan did, where they actually built this sort of kind of almost like a game that was based off one of their ads. And the ad was sort of a car was driving through a city, and the camera sort of zooms out, and what you see is that it's actually one of those marble maze games, and the car is actually kind of driving through sort of this marble maze-like city. There was a version of that content that was reproduced online, but you could actually play the game with the car. And so that's a case where you have sort of, it's kind of video, it's kind of a game, it's a sort of mix, and that type of unit has a lot of recall, right? I mean, I'm recalling it a couple of years later, and I do this for a living, but at the same time I am recalling it. And so we find that, if you can take that type of sort of long form content and sort of put it in the hands of consumers, this sort of owned media that you have, and allow them to do with it what they want to from an embedding standpoint, you can build a lot of free reach, and it can be very, very, very effective. They don't matter on their own. A like doesn't matter, a tweet doesn't matter unless something comes of it, and unless there's somebody to receive it. We kind of have this idea sort of in the industry that there's something innately valuable about the number of likes that you have on Facebook, or the number of tweets that your brand puts in a market. But basically, like any other form of advertising, it's the audience that matters. We don't care about the amount of creative I put in market unless there are people to receive that creative from an advertising perspective. And so one of the areas that we focus on a lot is not necessarily the volume of likes, not necessarily the volume of tweets, but the actual number of people that are being exposed to that information, and then what they do because of it. And then what they do because of it is really super important. So if I'm Hellmann's Mayonnaise, to your example, and they have a great piece of video content that's about how to make the best tuna salad in the world, and that's a 5-minute long clip, and it gets picked up by a food blog, which then gets sort of, that food blog is, say, super influential, and then it gets picked up in people's Twitter feeds. What Hellmann's is actually doing is they're doing two things. One, they're more or less earning free reach. They're also taking really well-developed content, theoretically, which is super impactful and gets that out. And not only is it impactful because of that, but research that we've seen within sort of social media work that we've done has said that something that organically appears is a lot more effective than something that's sort of forced at you. So if something organically appears in my Twitter feed, or something organically appears on my Facebook feed from a friend, from a blog that I trust, we see a lot more impact from an advertising effectiveness standpoint for that type of earned media than we see in plain, straight up bought media. So what you may lose in reach because you can't buy media, you do pick up an impact, and so sometimes it kind of net equals itself out from a gross number of heads turned type perspective.